Harriet Tubman was a woman of extraordinary courage who escaped slavery and became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading hundreds to freedom. Harriet Tubman, one of America's greatest heroes, was born into slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland around March 1822. She came from a family of enslaved people who worked on plantations in the brutal system of Southern slavery. Tubman's birth name was Araminta Ross, though she would later take her mother's name, Harriet. She had a small stature but possessed an iron will. Tubman's early years were marked by hardship and suffering. She was forced to work from the age of 5 or 6, first as a house servant and later in the fields. Harriet Tubman experienced the cruelty of slavery firsthand, enduring beatings and abuse throughout her childhood. In her early teens, around 1834 or 1835, Tubman suffered a traumatic head injury that would affect her for the rest of her life. An overseer threw a heavy metal weight at another enslaved person but hit Tubman instead, fracturing her skull. The injury caused her to experience seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes for the remainder of her days. She also began having vivid dreams and visions which she interpreted as messages from God. Despite this debilitating injury, Tubman continued to work in the fields, developing tremendous physical strength and endurance. She learned to navigate the woods and swamps of Maryland, skills that would prove invaluable in her future work. Tubman also developed a deep Christian faith that sustained her through the darkest times, believing that God had chosen her for a special purpose. In 1844, Araminta Ross married a free black man named John Tubman and took the name Harriet. The marriage gave her some measure of emotional support, but she remained enslaved while her husband was free. This disparity troubled her deeply, as she longed for the freedom that seemed so close yet remained out of reach. When Harriet's enslaver died in 1849, she feared she would be sold south to the Deep South, where conditions were even more brutal and escape nearly impossible. She made the bold decision to run away, even though it meant leaving her husband behind. John Tubman refused to accompany her and even threatened to report her plans to their enslaver. In the fall of 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery, making the dangerous 90-mile journey from Maryland to Pennsylvania alone. She traveled by night, following the North Star and using the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and abolitionists who helped enslaved people reach freedom. Tubman later recalled the moment she crossed into Pennsylvania as one of transcendent joy, saying she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person now that she was free. She felt like she was in heaven. But her happiness was incomplete because her family remained in bondage. Tubman settled in Philadelphia where she found work as a domestic servant and cook. She saved her money and began planning something extraordinary. Within a year of gaining her own freedom, Harriet Tubman made the dangerous decision to return to Maryland to rescue her family. This was not the action of someone content with personal liberty. Tubman could not rest while those she loved remained enslaved. In 1850, she made her first rescue mission, returning to Maryland to bring her niece and her niece's children to freedom. This was just the beginning of what would become her life's mission. Over the next decade, Tubman would make approximately 13 trips back into slave territory, personally leading around 70 enslaved people to freedom, including her brothers and her elderly parents. She gave detailed instructions to dozens more who found their own way north using her guidance. Harriet Tubman became one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. She operated with meticulous planning and extraordinary courage, never losing a passenger on her dangerous journeys. Tubman carried a gun for protection and to ensure that once people started the journey with her, they would not turn back and potentially expose the operation under torture or interrogation. She was absolutely fearless in her missions. Tubman used various disguises and strategies to avoid capture. Sometimes she would dress as a man, other times as an old woman. She carried forged papers and traveled on weekends when enslaved people had more freedom of movement and when newspapers would not print runaway notices until Monday. Tubman used songs to communicate coded messages, signaling when it was safe to move or when danger was near. The risks Tubman took were immense. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that escaped slaves be returned to their enslavers even if they reached free states, Tubman had to lead people all the way to Canada to ensure their safety. Slave catchers and bounty hunters actively pursued her, and rewards for her capture eventually totaled $40,000, an enormous sum at the time. Yet she was never caught and never lost a passenger. Her reputation grew among both those who sought freedom and those who sought to prevent it. Enslaved people called her Moses, after the biblical figure who led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. Tubman embraced this identity, seeing her work as divinely inspired. Southern slaveholders called her a dangerous criminal and desperately wanted to stop her operations. Harriet Tubman was not working alone in her efforts. She collaborated with other abolitionists, both black and white, who formed the Underground Railroad network. She worked closely with Thomas Garrett, a Quaker abolitionist in Wilmington, Delaware, and William Still, a black abolitionist in Philadelphia who documented the stories of escaped slaves. Tubman also became acquainted with Frederick Douglass, the famous formerly enslaved writer and orator, and John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed armed insurrection was necessary to end slavery. Tubman supported Brown's plans and helped him recruit followers, though she was ill and could not participate in his famous raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. When Brown was executed, Tubman mourned him as a martyr to the cause of freedom. During the 1850s, Tubman also became a public figure in abolitionist circles. She spoke at meetings and gatherings, telling her story and advocating for the end of slavery. Though she could not read or write, having been denied education as an enslaved person, Tubman was an effective and powerful speaker. Her first-hand accounts of slavery's brutality and her daring rescue missions inspired audiences throughout the North. She worked alongside other prominent abolitionists and women's rights activists, including Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists who saw connections between the struggle for racial justice and women's equality. Tubman supported women's suffrage throughout her life, believing that all people deserved equal rights and dignity. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet Tubman saw it as the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against slavery. She immediately offered her services to the Union Army. In 1862, Tubman went to South Carolina to serve as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers and refugees who had escaped from plantations as Union forces advanced through the South. Her knowledge of herbal medicines, learned during her years in slavery, proved valuable in treating dysentery and other diseases that plagued the army camps. But Tubman's contributions went far beyond nursing. Union commanders recognized her unique skills and experience, and she became a scout and spy for the Union Army. Harriet Tubman was the first woman to lead an armed military raid in American history. In June 1863, she guided Colonel James Montgomery and his 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in a raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Tubman had scouted the area, identified Confederate supply routes and torpedoes planted in the river, and spread word to enslaved people that liberation was coming. When the raid commenced, more than 700 enslaved people rushed to the Union gunboats to claim their freedom. The raid also destroyed millions of dollars worth of Confederate supplies and infrastructure. It was a stunning success, and Tubman's role was instrumental. Yet despite her critical military service, Tubman was never properly compensated by the Army and had to fight for decades to receive a military pension. Throughout the war, Tubman continued her intelligence work, moving through Confederate territory and gathering information from enslaved people about troop movements, supply lines, and fortifications. Her network of informants was extensive and reliable. The information she provided helped Union forces plan their operations and avoid ambushes. Tubman's work as a spy was dangerous and exhausting, but she never hesitated. She believed the war was a holy crusade to end the evil of slavery, and she was determined to do everything in her power to ensure Union victory and emancipation. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free, Tubman celebrated it as a step toward justice, though she knew the fight was far from over. After the Civil War ended in 1865 with Union victory and the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, Harriet Tubman faced new challenges. She returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled before the war and where she had brought her parents to live in a home she purchased. Tubman had married again in 1869 to a Union veteran named Nelson Davis, who was more than 20 years her younger. They had a loving relationship until his death in 1888. Despite her fame and her service to the nation, Tubman struggled financially for much of her later life. The government was slow to recognize her military service and grant her proper compensation. She received a small pension as the widow of Nelson Davis, but it was inadequate given her own contributions. Harriet Tubman devoted her later years to helping others, just as she had throughout her life. She was active in the women's suffrage movement, speaking at conventions and advocating for women's right to vote. Tubman saw no contradiction between fighting for racial justice and gender equality. She believed all forms of oppression were connected and must be challenged. She also worked to support elderly and indigent African Americans in her community. In 1896, Tubman purchased land adjacent to her home in Auburn and began raising funds to establish a home for aged and needy black people. After years of effort, the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged opened in 1908, providing care and dignity to those who had nowhere else to turn. Tubman also worked to preserve her own legacy and tell her story. In 1869, Sarah Bradford published a biography of Tubman based on extensive interviews, and the proceeds helped Tubman pay off her debts. A revised edition appeared in 1886. These books brought Tubman's story to a wider audience and cemented her place in American history. Yet even as her fame grew, Tubman remained humble and focused on service rather than personal glory. She lived simply and gave generously to those in need. Tubman was deeply religious throughout her life, attending the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Auburn and crediting God with guiding her through every danger and challenge. Her faith was not passive but active, demanding that believers work for justice and liberation. In her final years, Harriet Tubman's health declined. The head injury she suffered as a teenager continued to cause seizures and pain. She underwent brain surgery in 1898, reportedly refusing anesthesia and instead biting down on a bullet as she had seen soldiers do during the Civil War. The surgery provided some relief but could not reverse decades of suffering. Tubman also battled pneumonia and other ailments. In 1911, she became too frail to care for herself and was admitted to the rest home she had founded, spending her last days in the institution she had created to help others. Surrounded by friends and family, Tubman remained alert and engaged until near the end, telling stories of her adventures and encouraging others to continue the fight for justice. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died at approximately 91 years of age. Her funeral was held at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Auburn, and she was buried with military honors, a fitting recognition of her service to the nation. The city of Auburn mourned her passing, as did people across the country who had been inspired by her courage and dedication. In the years following her death, Tubman's reputation only grew. She became a symbol of resistance to oppression and a reminder that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through courage, faith, and determination. Schools, museums, and monuments have been named in her honor, and her story has been told and retold in books, films, and educational programs. Harriet Tubman's legacy is multifaceted and profound. She was a liberator who risked everything to free others from bondage, making the dangerous journey into slave territory again and again when she could have remained safely in the North. She was a military leader who served her country with distinction during its greatest crisis, providing intelligence and leading troops in combat. She was an activist who fought for women's suffrage and civil rights, recognizing that the struggle for justice is never finished. She was a humanitarian who cared for the sick, the elderly, and the poor, establishing institutions to serve those in need. And she was a symbol of the indomitable human spirit, proving that even the most oppressive systems can be overcome through courage and faith. Tubman's story resonates across generations because it speaks to fundamental human aspirations for freedom and dignity. She was born into a system designed to crush her spirit and deny her humanity, yet she refused to accept that fate. She escaped slavery not to enjoy personal freedom alone but to return and liberate others, putting herself in constant danger for the sake of people she loved and people she had never met. Tubman understood that true freedom is not individual but collective, that no one can be fully free while others remain in bondage. This insight drove her work on the Underground Railroad and her activism in later years. She never stopped fighting for a more just and equal society. The obstacles Tubman overcame were staggering. She was a woman in a time when women had few rights and little power. She was black in a society built on white supremacy and racial hierarchy. She was illiterate in a culture that valued education and formal learning. She was poor in a nation increasingly defined by wealth and economic status. She suffered from a debilitating medical condition that could strike at any moment, causing seizures and unconsciousness. Yet none of these barriers stopped her. Tubman turned every disadvantage into a source of strength. Her experience of slavery gave her the knowledge and determination to fight it. Her gender allowed her to move through certain spaces with less suspicion. Her faith gave her courage when fear might have paralyzed others. Harriet Tubman was not a perfect person, and she did not accomplish her goals alone. She worked within networks of abolitionists and allies who shared her commitment to ending slavery. She benefited from the changing political landscape that made the Civil War and emancipation possible. She made difficult choices, including carrying a gun and threatening to use it on those who might endanger her missions. But these complexities make her story more powerful, not less. Tubman was a real person who faced real dilemmas and made real sacrifices. She did not have the luxury of moral purity or simple choices. She lived in a world of violence and oppression and fought back with every tool at her disposal. The recognition Tubman has received in recent years reflects a growing appreciation for her contributions and a broader understanding of American history. For too long, the stories of women and people of color were marginalized or ignored in historical narratives. Tubman's story challenges us to expand our understanding of heroism and leadership. She was not a president or a general in the conventional sense, though she led people to freedom and commanded respect from military leaders. She was not wealthy or formally educated, yet she outwitted and outmaneuvered those who sought to capture her. Tubman demonstrated that courage and moral clarity are more important than social status or formal credentials. In 2016, the United States Treasury announced that Harriet Tubman would be featured on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder and president responsible for the forced removal of Native Americans. This decision sparked debate but also reflected Tubman's iconic status. She would be the first African American and the first woman in more than a century to appear on U.S. paper currency. Though the redesign has been delayed, the very fact that Tubman was chosen represents a significant shift in how Americans understand their history and whom they choose to honor. Tubman's image on currency would be a daily reminder of the nation's complicated past and its ongoing struggle to live up to its ideals of freedom and equality. Harriet Tubman's life spanned nearly a century of American history, from the height of slavery through the Civil War and Reconstruction into the early 20th century. She witnessed tremendous change and was an agent of that change, helping to bring about the end of slavery and the expansion of rights for African Americans and women. Yet Tubman also saw how much work remained to be done. Even after slavery ended, Black Americans faced discrimination, violence, and economic exploitation. Even after women gained the right to vote in 1920, 7 years after Tubman's death, true equality remained elusive. Tubman understood that freedom is not a destination but a continuous struggle, requiring vigilance and courage from every generation. Today, Harriet Tubman stands as one of the most admired figures in American history. Her story is taught in schools across the country. The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park preserves sites associated with her life and work in Maryland. The Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York, includes her home and the residence for the elderly that she founded. Countless books, documentaries, and works of art have explored her life and legacy. Tubman has become a cultural icon, appearing on postage stamps, in statues and murals, and in popular culture. She represents the best of the American spirit, the refusal to accept injustice, the willingness to sacrifice for others, and the belief that ordinary people can change the world. Harriet Tubman was even in death an inspiration to future generations, a woman who proved that one person's courage can make an extraordinary difference in the lives of many.